I'll I'll share my screen and get started though. Let's have a look. Can you all see?
Yeah, all good. All good. Perfect.
So I guess I wanted to start by setting a bit of an open tone and maybe dispelling a myth about the corporate world with one of my favorite quotes. So this is from Daniel Kahneman, who of course is a giant in our field. But actually, he didn't have too much exposure to large organizations until really late in his career. And I really liked what he said a few years ago. I think this was about 2017 at the People Analytics Conference in Wharton about his exposure. So in the previous couple of years, he'd kind of looked under the curtain at large organizations. He'd started some consulting engagements, and he had expected these large organizations to be really optimal, rational, profit-making machines. But actually he found the exact opposite in quite an extreme way. So that the words here are pretty strong. The amount of folly in the way these places are run, the stupid procedures that they have, the really, really poor thinking you see all around you is actually fairly troubling. And I thought this was really just a great quote. Organizations love to see themselves as optimal and rational. Sometimes when we speak either to students or even to academics, there is an impression, a myth that maybe this is how they run as well. So this is kind of the central proposition that I want to talk about today. The first is, if this is the case, it's kind of weird. You know, why would large organizations that are supposed to be profitably optimized be so suboptimal? How can behavioral science potentially help make things better? What stands in its way? And I guess perhaps what you are most interested in is how as social scientists can you potentially contribute to this problem? You know, what challenges are you going to face that you haven't necessarily learned in a master's program when either you enter or continue your career? In order for me to get a good measure of that and to get a measure of kind of who I'm speaking to today, I'd love to hear about your experiences within corporate organizations, and I guess your reaction to a quote like this. So are you really shocked by this? Is this a surprise to you that a figure like Daniel Kahneman would say something like this? Or actually, does it just confirm your experiences that you've already had with organizations, either working with them or maybe even just in things like internships or hiring processes? Does anyone have a view?
Hi, James. I personally worked for quite a large, or did until I was furloughed over the summer, for quite a large hotel. And this doesn't surprise me all that much. There have been many cases. I think for the people on the ground, it was quite, when it was busy at least, it was very optimal. When it wasn't busy, probably less so. But on the upper levels of management, there was often a lot of maneuvering for the sake of maneuvering rather than actual optimization in it.
Yeah, interesting. So, you know, actually what you've got to there is one of the central themes that I'll go on to there, which you describe as maneuvering, which I guess gives this sense of individual political actors looking after their own interests. And those interests might not necessarily align with the long-term profitability interests of the organization. I think that as a central idea is something that I will return to again and again. Anyone else before I move on?
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. It's dealing with government institutions. I found working in different countries, for example, in UK, if you deal with government institutions where there is a lots of sort of self-importance, and it's not actually because we're not so much accountable, whatever they do, it's inherently important and nobody challenging it and nobody's not in position to challenge it. And it's just, I think it's a cultural phenomenon, can be that, because unless you change the old structure of a government, nothing would ever change.
Mm. Yeah, I think this is true, that as soon as you become a leader of an organization, there is this kind of sense of self-importance that often doesn't necessarily lead or lean itself to rationality. I think one of the really interesting things that I certainly have been considering in recent years is just why, when you think about applied behavioral science, and especially organizations like the Behavioural Insights team, why is it that even though these issues exist within public sector organizations, governmental institutions, they have still managed to embrace and get some way to what we would consider to be proper applied behavioral science? And in actual fact, even though corporate organizations would consider themselves to be more agile, more innovative than those big bureaucracies, they're actually way, way, way behind. You know, there might be a case to say the field of consumer psychology has moved on a bit, but certainly in the field of organizational design and culture, they are still way behind these government institutions. So I think there seems to be a special case here that I always think is worth exploring. By way of personal introduction, I would say that I certainly didn't start from academia, and in a sense, feel like I was probably contributing to this, this folly when it comes to organizational design for about 10 years of my life. So I started out in human resources in the technology industry. I started in an organization called Publicis Sapient. I moved on to the people ops team at Google, and that led me into the wonderful world of consulting. I did a number of different roles there, which culminated in an MD of the engagement practice at a big comms firm. The reason why there's a big picture of a peacock here is that kind of is my both metaphorical and literal image representation of my time in consulting. And it leads me back to one of the last projects I did for that firm, which was for a big FMCG company that had been bought out by an even bigger FMCG company. And at that moment in time, they had asked us to do something for their leadership team to bring them all together. So at great expense, we flew 400 leaders from all corners of the world over to this big 2-day event in Paris. We hired out a glass dome at the Parc Floral, which had actual peacocks kind of floating around outside. We brought over a NASA astronaut to be the keynote speaker to talk about the fragility of Earth when seen from space and how we should all look after it. And everyone had an amazing 2 days. Everyone had a great experience. We did our job as a consultancy. The client was pleased. But I had started to become interested in social science, and I couldn't help thinking that actually there didn't seem to be any legitimate objective for this. You know, there was a loose idea about getting people aligned behind a vision, but other than that, there wasn't anything really firm, and there certainly wasn't any sense of measuring our effectiveness against some stated outcome. So I had become kind of slightly cynical, and this is where I started to see maybe some of our work through Daniel Kahneman's eyes. So from that point, I decided to go back to school. I joined the executive master's program at the London School of Economics in behavioural science, and from that decided to start More Than Now. Now, the reason that I decided to start from scratch, I'm not a natural business owner, I have no aspiration to be an entrepreneur, but I really didn't think that I could do the sort of work that I wanted to do within existing consultancy models. And that is because I think that legitimate social science, legitimate behavioural science actually is a real threat to traditional consultancy, and I'll go on to explain why in a moment. Almost the sole focus of our work at More Than Now is this idea of causal field research. So when I was at school, although a lot of the work was focused on kind of understanding biases, that certainly seems to be the thing that has captured the attention of the public in terms of popular books. The thing that I was really interested in, and maybe this is because of my experience over the decade previous, is I really love this idea of causal research and particularly randomized controlled experimentation. And this is because it gave us the potential, gave the opportunity for people who are planning and running and conducting these interventions to really know and isolate their effect. And even though that might sound fairly obvious to social scientists, to academics, it remains extremely novel, remarkably novel in the world of work. Now, on the one hand, we have been really successful in that. This was, More Than Now was founded 5 years ago. We've run multiple randomized controlled trials for very big, influential employers, people like Transport for London, BT, Ericsson, Novartis, the organizations you can see there. And yet, I still find it incredibly difficult to engage with new clients. And that's not because of the technical work that I'm sure you will have all learned over the last 2 years, but it's about how scared people are of this process. It's the fact that it remains incredibly unique from an organizational perspective and really unfamiliar as well. The thing that I'd like to talk about now is why. So why is that? Going back to this, what's the cause of Daniel Kahneman's insight? I suspect it comes down to this. So this is a fairly general kind of idea about human behavior. But I believe that the more complex, maybe even the scarier the question we're facing, the more we tend to crave simple, overconfident answers. And the less, therefore, we are likely to respond to whatever challenge we're facing in a nuanced, meaningful way. And what I'm interested in is when this is interrupted in certain domains. So for instance, in academic life, this may well be true, but challenges to it are also baked into the system. So we are trained to debate with each other in a fairly unemotional way. When you are a student and you submit a paper, you know it's going to be marked in a relatively objective way. And of course, kind of the central idea around academic life is this idea of the peer review, that if you put forward an oversimplified, overconfident answer, that's going to damage your reputation. In your personal life, this kind of proposition also holds true. But when we are making important financial relationship decisions, we still kind of know that if we tell ourselves a story about what house to buy or what organization to invest in, if we make a bad decision, that's going to come back and bite us in the future. So we should take a moment and make sure we're considering these things in a more optimal way. Now, what I want you to consider now, and what I'd love to hear your ideas about, is why those same incentives might not exist in an organizational structure. And in actual fact, why might it be beneficial for individual actors to really lean in to simple, overconfident answers? Why might that continue this cycle maybe of irrational behavior, irrational decisions, and a disinterest in causal research in the realm of big corporate organizations? Any ideas?
Possible, but when it's a complicated question, for example, Brexit, or should the PPC license fee be criminal or non-criminal offense, so on. If you give very simple options to people to ask, you can sort of nudge people certain way to answer. But if we actually start looking for more research or there is more options to answers, maybe people start discovering things that maybe big organizations don't want to be discovered.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That actually, in a way, sometimes organizations are built on the idea that they can have a crystal ball that they can see into the future, and people invest in them for that exact reason. So any sense that there's nuance or uncertainty might actually threaten how people view the very nature of the organization. I think that's a really interesting idea. Well, does anyone have any ideas about why embracing that sort of nuance might actually harm your career, might harm your reputation as a leader within an organization?
There is a thought that every organization have their own sort of a spirit or outlook, and whoever is invested into that, they already invested into that outlook. And if you don't now embrace it as a new leader, or sort of becoming a senior leader, or wanted to at least improve your position in this organization, you want to change it for good, yes, but if organization or whoever is funding it don't want to change it, very soon your career will end very quickly, and you don't get to change anything to anybody. You can't even help yourself. But if you embrace the culture, however horrible it is, maybe if you're a good human or whatever it means, you can just tweak it, maybe just a little bit. That's mean going for a big change would end your career, but if you go along, you can maybe nudge things along. Maybe that's the answer.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So I kind of have a couple of answers to this that are pretty general, but you can think about it in line with your own experiences. So I think, unlike academia and unlike in our personal lives, the incentive to overcome this problem and to really embrace the complexity of decision making is actually far less incentivized than you might expect. So actually, if you are an individual leader or an individual decision maker, actually for the reasons that you just outlined, it may well be in your interest just to toe the line. Equally, in the same way that TV programs and news broadcasters often like people with really firm, concrete views, it can be great for leaders, even if they might be wrong in the future, to give a sense of confidence, to give a sense of certainty. And any idea around nuance is actually seen as a weakness. The other thing is that it's possible that when you are thinking about complex questions within large organizations, often there is really no a consequence for you in the future. A great example for this might be what an organization should do now around its working from home policy. Now, the truth is, we don't really know. We can draw on as much evidence as we like, but of course, the future of that is uncertain. However, for an individual HR director, for instance, who probably is only going to be enrolled for 3, 4, 5 years, there's not much of a consequence to making a big, bold, decades-long decision. Because A, it's unlikely that that decision will ever really be measured, and B, by the time the consequences of that decision kind of roll out, it's very possible that that person isn't going to be in the same role anymore and may well have even moved to a different organization. On the other hand, the incentives for consultancies to really hammer home concrete, simple ideas is really high, because that's what people like to buy. People don't like to buy complexity. They don't like to buy research. Ultimately, what they want is answers. So when a consultancy turns up at your door, your real question for them is, what should I do to solve the problem that I have? And unfortunately, that often leads to suboptimal, overconfident decisions. And that is what I describe as the consultancy paradox. And I think any social scientist who wants to get into this world and remain a legitimate researcher needs to be really interested in the dynamics of this problem, how to potentially overcome them. Is there any questions about that before I move on to a little bit about how we've tried to solve it at More Than Now, or any reflections? No, okay, I'll move on. So our response to this at More Than Now has actually been really simple. So what you'll find most consultancies and most individual leaders try to do is to solve a big problem with a big answer. One of the things that I thought might be interesting as an example is to focus on the challenge of inclusion. This is an area that many corporate organizations are wrestling with at the moment. Now, what we'll find most of our partners want is for us to solve this big, complex challenge in one fell swoop. How can we possibly design an inclusive culture from scratch? And what you'll find that most organizations have done is two things. The first is that they have really pushed this idea of the business case for inclusion. And the idea of that is that if you can convince people that inclusion is a good thing for the organization and a good thing for them personally, then they will just naturally be inclusive from moment to moment. And when that hasn't seemed to work, then this secondary idea of unconscious bias training has come in. So again, this attacks the whole problem all at once. If you can remove bias from people's minds, then they will go around their organization from moment to moment and they will behave inclusively, making objective decisions. Now, I'm sure that I don't have to tell this group that those are very flawed ideas. They are simple ideas that it's very easy to embrace because they solve a big, complex, scary problem. Now, our alternative is very simple and leads us to a space where we can potentially do proper causal experimental research. And that simply works by breaking the issue down into very small ideas. So the slide that you can see in front of you is really just a tiny fraction of what that might look like. You might, for instance, start with how people enter into the organization. How do we make sure our recruitment is inclusive? Even then, you need to break it down. How are we attracting our people? And that might break down even further into what message might we have on our website? How are we writing our job descriptions? How are we sourcing and selecting people on LinkedIn? As soon as you get into the assessment process, how are we screening CVs? What's our interview structure? And you can imagine if you did this across the whole organization, it might lead to how people are onboarded, how you meet your team for the first time, into experiences that you might have every day in meeting rooms and in after work drinks. So the reason why we are so keen for organizations to do this is because as soon as you get to the lower level of this diagram, you immediately have potentially a way to intervene. Most importantly, you also have a behavior that you can potentially measure. So for instance, for something like employer brand messaging, and I'll have to talk through this example. I have a couple of slides, but I can't share them as this talk is being recorded, but I'll talk you through the experiment, is that we can potentially change the way an organization introduces itself to potential new candidates, and we can do that in a relatively controlled environment. Then we can ask them about their hiring decisions, whether they'd like to apply or whether they wouldn't, and we can see how that behavior has changed depending on the message that they have been given. So one of the experiments that we did recently was focused specifically on gender and technology. So there is this big, almost universal challenge about how do we encourage more women to get into technology. And one of our clients had asked us to explore this for them. Now, the first thing that we did was break the process down, go onto their website, and we could see that they had spent a lot of time thinking about representation. There was an image of a woman, for instance, on their front page, but their headline really focused on individual growth. I think it was something like, push yourself further than you could imagine. That was the headline that they were using. So what we wanted to test is there a possibility that this might be gendered? You know, if we take that message and explore other motives that you could put on your front page, maybe the value, for instance, that organization delivers to society, and this was a big telecommunications firm, or potentially something more about the type of culture that you might experience there. This organization had a really strong sense of community, but that was buried within the text rather than put up to the front. And lo and behold, we found out that this absolutely was the case. Then we ran this through a randomized controlled experiment. It seemed like far more men were applying when they saw this individualized message, far less women. And actually, it didn't reverse. It just became much more equal when we shared more information about how you might experience work at this particular organization. And we do these tiny small tests at each stage. And it's really important to know that no one intervention, of course, is going to cause a big inclusive culture. But when you add them all up and you do that work over a number of years, then suddenly it's something that becomes quite impactful. Is there any questions actually about that particular experiment, about the nature of that experiment, or actually any broader reflections about how our discipline can potentially respond to the big challenge of inclusion and culture within organizations? There must be something.
I had a quick question about the experiment. When you found the equalization in gender with the more community-based question, did you find that that was through actual more applicants, female applicants applying just generally, or was there a drop in male applicants as well as an increase in female?
There was an increase in male applicants as well. So this doesn't always happen, but the reason why this was a particularly successful experiment from the organization's perspective is because not only did we find a message that improved the effectiveness of their talent attractions overall, but it moved men up a little bit and it moved women up a lot to create the balance that they were seeking.
Great, thank you.
Anyone else? Okay. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about was the future as I see it, and how some of these ideas can potentially answer even bigger problems that we might have. So what we tend to find when we apply this think small methodology is that we reduce our work into formal decision-making moments within an organization. So we might be interested in hiring, recruitment, pay decisions. We might be interested in how people's performance is being evaluated. And you can imagine as social scientists why this is the case, because there are clear metrics that we can get to and measure. There are clear processes that we can explore and intervene with. And therefore, there is nice, easy ways to run randomized controlled trials because we can tweak some of those processes and we can see the effect that it has. One of the things that our clients often ask us about, though, is what they really consider to be this broader idea of culture, which is how people are interacting on a day-to-day basis. And actually, this is really tricky to get to, because if you follow this diagram for interactions, it gets quite complex. You might think about inclusive culture in terms of inclusive meetings. And even when you get to that broad goal, you could break that down. How do we have meetings where everyone has an equal share of voice? You may have heard this thing called the hippo effect, where how do we make sure that it's not just the highest paid person's opinion that really gets heard? How do we make sure that we're democratizing the best ideas rather than the ideas of the authority? Equally, there is a sense of who gets jobs, at the end of a meeting. How do we make sure that's done in a rigorous way and it's not done based on bias and stereotypes? Now, in the past, there's a huge amount of literature around why these might be problems, but actually it's very, very difficult to measure them because they happen in the physical environment. And I think one of the things that has been extraordinarily exciting about lockdown, and probably will continue in the future, is just how many of these interactions are now digitized as we are talking now, and therefore how many of those behaviors actually can be measured and are being measured. So one of the things that I am only just exploring now with some of our partners, and what I genuinely think, without any sense of hyperbole, will completely change the nature of how we think about organizational culture, is this dynamic here. So we're using Zoom now. In most of our client interactions, we use Microsoft Teams. Microsoft Teams is obviously part of a much broader suite of tools, Outlook, Word, etc., etc. And Microsoft has a tool called Workplace Analytics where it tracks that data. So it knows all sorts of data points about how teams are working with each other, from how many one-to-ones you have with your manager, to how long you spend working, measured by the amount of time you spend, for instance, answering emails, to an idea about your network within an organization, depending on the breadth and the depth of how many people you're emailing on a day-to-day basis. It gives us all sorts of data. Now, if you take that data and map it to a very traditional way of measuring culture within organizations, which is to ask people through surveys, This is something that organizations have been doing for a long time. And you map it equally to some interesting performance metric or ethics metric that you're really interested in. Suddenly, this creates a whole new dynamic, because you start to be able to explore maybe some of the interactions that are potentially causing not just how people feel through the survey data, but also their performance, some outcome that we're really interested in from an organizational perspective. And this isn't necessarily causal research. This is just an idea to develop hypotheses. You know, what is it? How can we support people to have digital interactions that are going to help their working lives? I think that the data in front of us now can really support that. What I also hope that it will lead to is causal experimentation, where we don't just assume those hypotheses are correct, but we might say, okay, it looks like one-to-ones with your manager and more one-to-ones with your manager correlates with some important performance metric. And it might be that because of some literature we found, we predict that that's a causal relationship. And therefore, can we design an intervention that encourages more one-to-ones, more one-to-one time between a manager and an employee? And can, if we do that, does that then have the following effect that we have? Is it true that if a HR team really encourage managers to spend more one-to-one time, they will see the increase in performance that they want? And that to me is a kind of, I want to say, utopian research project. We could never do it in the past because those physical interactions were so difficult to get to. With a tool like Microsoft Workplace Analytics, when you put it into this bigger picture, it becomes very exciting. And I suspect that this will cause a closer gap between academics and practitioners, simply because this data point is so unique and novel that it will help develop our understanding of culture and change. Any questions or reflections on that? I'm sure there must be something. Have you all seen data sets like this? Is it something that you'd like to get your hands on?
Yes, it would be interesting. But do you think now when so much communication is online, especially councils, big government institutions, do you think it would actually sort of end with reconstruction with those institutions, or everything will go on as it is?
Well, if I had my kind of consulting hat on, I'd give you a very overconfident, simple answer. But the true answer to that is I just don't know. I mean, I think what's really interesting about this data is that I think and hope that organizations should really be interested in exploring that question from a research perspective. And of course, what they will find, or what they have the potential to find in the coming years, is they can explore the differences between teams who work physically together versus teams who work digitally together. Now, of course, they won't have the possibility to get the same data on the teams that are working physically, but they can certainly compare performance metrics, and they can certainly see the digital interactions between those virtual teams. So, you know, if I was a CEO of a large organization, I would want social scientists within my organization exploring these questions and helping virtual teams find the best way to work together, giving them hints and tips about what seems to be working for the highest performing virtual teams. And that can definitely lead into things like communication channels, how often people might want to work physically together. I think all these questions are unanswered. There is a lot of speculation happening around them in the consultancy sphere, but ultimately I think that will witter out into nothing because it doesn't really give us firm answers. And I think there is a huge space, huge opportunity for social science if we can create the space for it, and if the new generation coming into the organizations really embrace this idea of causal research and randomized controlled trials.
Thank you.
But also, you mentioned organizations in sort of private sector, as I understand. But for a government institution, what would be incentive to sort of dismantle as it is and become, new? But also lots of people who've been working in those organizations, would they implement ultimately something what would possibly lead to, no need for them anymore?
Yeah, I mean, potentially. I think these are all judgment calls that individual leaders of organizations need to take. I think one of the things that I would say, even if you just looked at it from a self-interest perspective, is we, again, just don't know what will happen if there is a large-scale embrace of flexible working from home. We have very little research on what that will do to teams more broadly, as well as to potentially the performance of an organization as well. So I would say there is an interest for everyone to start to explore these questions, but I also completely understand why some maybe public sector institutions would be reluctant to go first. So I think it's a case by case basis. I can see some questions coming through on the chat as well, so I might see if I can read them out. So a question about recommendations for programming skills that are required to answer some of these questions. I guess, if you don't mind kind of clarifying this a little bit, you mean the skills to potentially get the analysis from these data sets. Is that correct? Okay, thanks, Manant. Yeah, exactly right. So the first thing I should say is I'm not a data scientist, so I'm probably not the best person to ask for that. I think what has happened, because we are relatively early on within social science, that you have generalists that are trying to do everything. So you will find at the moment in advisory work that the same person that's designing the intervention, the same person who holds a relationship with the client might also be the same person who's running the analysis as well. And I think that restricts our sophistication when it comes to large scale analysis. What I would suggest is happening in the future, and in fact, we're already trying to become specialists at More Than Now, rather than have these fully functioning behavioral scientists, is that the more data that we can get and the more we can bring these different sources together, the more that there will be routes open for specialist behavioral scientists. So what I would say is that if you are particularly into data science, you're particularly into programming, that will be a route. It might not be a route right now, but it will be a route that I suspect will emerge in the future. Just like I suspect there will be routes for behavioral scientists who maybe don't have those skills, but are really good at relationships, are really good at opening the space for research, are really good at communicating the results of that research. And actually, I'll move on to that now, because that really does start getting into the career aspect of this. In fact, it's the next slide, so good timing. One of the things that I'm probably most interested in terms of the future of applied behavioral science and our ability to explore these broader questions is just how broad I think the field is becoming. And I would really like your thoughts on this, because I think the breadth of skills that a behavioral scientist needs now within the corporate world really is quite dizzying. You might learn data analysis, you might learn research skills from a university perspective, but because you're entering this world that isn't necessarily ready to embrace those skills for all the reasons I've outlined, you have to create space for them yourself. And that means all sorts of other things. So you have to really evangelize for this area. And that sometimes means really simplifying your work, really being able to explain it to someone who has no idea what behavioral science or social science or causal research or randomized experimentation is. That's a very tricky thing to do. That can lead into this idea of education as well. Sometimes, particularly when you're working with someone who doesn't understand the skills that you have, and that will be very common, again, when you move into the consulting world, you have to have a really trusting relationship. You have to almost act as a bit of a coach to them. Certainly what we find in a day-to-day basis, if if we have encouraged someone to, especially in HR teams, to do a randomized controlled experiment, that puts some personal risk on them. You know, in the past, they could just do anything and it would never be measured and it wouldn't matter. And then suddenly you have this robust methodology where potentially you're going to get a null effect in 6 months. That's a scary thing. So you end up being a bit of a confidant. And then finally, I would say, because this is a relatively new field, there is simply so much potential for people with new ideas to have a fairly big influence. And I'll give you an example for that. Even in the past few weeks, we have just had an idea about the sustainability of working from home. This was an idea that we felt was really not being spoken about. There was an obsession about working from home and productivity. There was an obsession about working from home and personal well-being, but no one had really thought about the environmental impact of this. As it turns out, we think that the impact is primarily driven by how people behave when they're working from home. And these will be individual choices that we make on a day-to-day basis. And we believe that employers should really take responsibility for influencing those behaviors. So suddenly this becomes a social science problem. And yet no one really seems to have thought about it. So suddenly we have to go out to our clients. We have to position this problem. We have to think about what we're actually offering and how we're going to offer it. And all these other skills, this idea of creating the space for us to apply our research, apply our experiments, apply our data analysis, that is almost 70, 80% of the work. So it's something that I would always encourage you to think about. You don't necessarily have to do it all, but I think some reflection on where your skills are, what you particularly enjoy, and how you can carve out a role where they're used is something that I will always advise people coming into the field for the first time. I guess that's probably a good place to kind of open up about any other questions you might have about entering into this field, particularly in the corporate space, and I'll answer however I can. Feel free to use the chat because I have managed to work out where it is and how to use it.
Hi, James. I had a quick question about like traditional consultancy and your background in that, because obviously in psychology there's a lot of talk about how the applicability of results, and so how in a lab not always results can actually apply to real life. Did you find that on like corporate retreats, that what you can achieve at a corporate retreat, it cannot actually be, or does not always get replicated when they return to their work?
Yeah, I mean, this is the awkward thing, right? About I think about behavioural insights that one of the core propositions is that context matters, and actually what effect you find in one place might, for whatever reason, simply not show in another context. So I think this idea that many actual behavioural informed consultancies are projecting, that you can bring behavioural insights and kind of wave it as a magic wand over a particular project, and then you can assume that that intervention becomes more successful, I really think is a fallacy. And this is the idea that we really draw quite a red line around causal research. You know, we are certainly inspired by the literature, of course, and we are certainly inspired by other best practices for other organizations, but we will always relentlessly say to our clients, we have to test whether this intervention works within your context. And unless we do that, we really have no idea. So I think you're right. You know, the traditional way of doing it is you go to some conference, you go to some retreat, you hear about best practices that other organizations might be using. Firstly, we have no idea whether they've measured those best practices, so we don't know their effectiveness at all. And secondly, even if they did and it was effective, we would still have no idea whether they would necessarily replicate within the context of our organization. So it's actually, when you think of it from a social science perspective, it's very difficult to justify how these interventions are kind of conceived and rolled out. Any other questions?
Thank you so much, James. Yeah, if anyone's got any questions, just feel free to pop them in the chat box or unmute yourselves and we do have time for a fair few more. So.
Well, in this case, I use a moment. It's may I ask, is your work is more similar or kind of overlap to the Danish Research Institute, Happiness Research Institute?
Can you tell me a bit more?
It's did you hear my question?
Yeah, was it that our research is aligned to, did you say the Danish Happiness Institute? Is that right?
Yeah. And what I mean is when I look to this year's happiness report, what constitutes for happiness, and I think it would overlap with inclusiveness, is when people feel that even contradicting ideas would be heard and sort of debated instead of sort of a default option. And from debate, new ideas will grow.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I have to say, I don't know too much about the work of that institute, but I do think that More Than Now, by its very nature, is founded on this idea that there are millions and millions and millions of people who work in organizations on a day-to-day basis, and we simply do not take their well-being or happiness seriously at all. So these are serious problems. Sometimes they are not seen as serious, but I think there is a lot of misery in corporate organizations because we have designed these structures in poor, suboptimal ways. And actually, if we could design organizations that that made people happier at the same time as helping them be more productive, which actually a lot of the core theories of things like self-determination, motivation would predict, then I think that would be a kind of win-win. It would be a win for the employees, it would be a win for the organization, it would be a win for our economies as well. That's a bit of a simplification, but I do think that the more research on happiness and well-being can interact with research on organizational design, I think that would be a good thing. But once again, I think the idea that these things are really tested properly and robustly within organizations is still very new and very niche. There's another question coming through around having to individually apply and readjust interventions for our organizations, which is also a new nice path for recurring income. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, in a way, I suspect the future of, actually, I'll start again. So we tend to do a lot of diverse work. So it tends to be our experiments are run whatever our client asks us. But there's another a consultancy by the name of Signal that you may have heard of, Signol, that is worth looking at. So they conducted a really long-term, robust, randomized controlled trial on airplane pilots. So the intervention was almost a digital app that supported those airline pilots to fly in an environmentally friendly way. Now, I'm on the borderline of expertise here because I don't really know what that means, but it turns out that the decisions you make as a pilot seem to have a big impact on your fuel efficiency, and this particular intervention helped them. Now, because this was such a serious issue and because they found a really interesting effect size, they were able to say, you know, we saved you millions and millions of pounds. We saved you significant fuel efficiency to the degree that you are now a more environmentally friendly airline. And they were able to turn this into a product that they could bring to other airlines over and over and over again. So I think there is some interesting discussion around what does it mean to be an entrepreneur as a social scientist. You know, do you want to just roll out a kind of scientific process that randomized controlled trials again and again and again across a whole diversity of problems? Or do you really want to focus very tightly on a problem that could potentially save organizations huge amounts of money while delivering some social good, and then do that again and again and again and again? It's a great question because it leads into this other space that we don't really work in, but I think is a real great career opportunity for social scientists, which is the technology industry. You know, the apps that are being built in the same way as Microsoft Workplace Analytics gives us all this data, gives you the opportunity to experiment with behavior and help people achieve their own goals while you're helping the organization achieve theirs.
very interesting. I think there was another question above that one about game theory in your work, if you can see it. How have you used game theory in your work?
Not yet. So if there's someone out there who wants to apply game theory to an organizational setting, then I think the door is definitely open. You just have to find the right opportunity. Unfortunately, I don't have any examples.
I guess I was wondering, so you obviously mentioned that there's a lot of kind of possible skills that could be applicable to the field of the behavioral science consultancy, and actually there's such a wide range of all these skills that it's sometimes hard to kind of pinpoint what is or kind of mark the kind of most important skills. But do you have advice, or what kind of advice would you give someone aspiring to build a career in this domain of behavioral science consultancy? So is there any skill in particular that you would highlight, or what's the kind of like, obviously it's a bit ironic really, because your whole talk has been like, oh, people want simple answers, and this is precisely what I'm asking, whether you have a single
I think I do.
You know what I mean?
I think I do have a simple answer. So I think the mistake that often people make when they are just out of university or just out of academia is that they focus purely on those orange skills that I've got on the slide there. So this is their research and their data analysis. And they think that if they can rock up at an organization and just put those on the table, then everything else is just going to happen naturally. That might happen if you work in an organization that really, really understands behavioral science. They will know exactly where you slot into their process and program and work. But what most people will find, because there aren't that many of those organizations that exist at this time, is that they're more likely to be working in an organization where people don't really understand your potential. They don't really understand how your skills can be applied. So actually, the biggest skill that you can have when you're thinking about your career is just to take those blinkers off and just be really curious about how you can communicate that value to others. And again, you can kind of pick those words out and the things that are going to be most effective for you, but it does mean, a lot of effort in terms of how am I going to network around this organization? How do I communicate my skills, not in the way that I've been talking about them at university, but to someone who actually might not care that much, or might only have 5 minutes to spare, or you might only have carved out 10 minutes for a coffee. And the other thing is really, really taking your work and thinking about how it can be simplified. We all entered into this field hearing insights that were simple, right? It's easy to critique, for instance, dual system processing and system 1 and system 2, but that's how I came into this world. And yes, now I can talk about the inaccuracy of that and so on and so on. But I would never have got here unless I was able to go, oh yeah, planner and doer, and yeah, no, I don't follow through on my New Year's Eve resolutions. And unless we're willing to do that work when we're outside the academic field, we can never really engage people. So it's a bit of a simple answer, because there are no, like, I'm not giving you an instruction of how to do it, but just taking the blinkers off from is the best I can do.
No, that makes sense. Yeah. And it's more of an applicable answer to people with different skill set, I guess, rather than just highlighting like a single skill or something. It's kind of applicable that it's an applicable advice that you can kind of tailor based on the person. Yeah. It makes sense. Absolutely. Any more questions from anybody? I am unfortunately going to have to nip off myself, but you're more than welcome to keep using the space. If anyone would like to ask James some more questions, I will make you a co-host now, so this meeting doesn't end. Or so if anyone's got any questions at all, indeed, I most wholeheartedly agree. It was a very useful talk, a very interesting talk, definitely for a lot of us who are graduating just now in this job market. So very applicable to the current times for this cohort specifically. So thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for coming from my part. And yeah, like I said, if anybody wants to stick around and ask some questions, but yeah, from my end, thank you, James.
Thanks for inviting me, Ella.
Thank you. See you later. Bye.